I've always been a fan of puzzle games, from all-time classics like Tetris to niche wonders like Baku Baku Animal, but one of my absolute favourite series is Picross. As many people did, I first encountered the series with Mario Picross on the original Game Boy in the 1990s. The gameplay is dead simple. You have to uncover a picture by identifying which squares in a grid should be shaded, but the only clues you have is the number in each row and column that are to be shaded and in what groups. However, the puzzles generally require a fair amount of logical deduction to solve, with each new tile shaded adding vital information to help solve the rest of the puzzle. Since Mario Picross, I've played a good number of the Picross titles on Switch, but not published by Nintendo, as well as replaying the two Nintendo Switch Online entries. But it caused me to wonder where this series came from, where it went, why it is still connected to Nintendo despite no longer being made or published by them, and what the future might hold for the series. So, block out some time and settle in for a Nintendo Forecast deep dive on the Picross series. Although better known to Nintendo fans under the Picross moniker, these puzzles have had many names and a long history. Early crosswords used to include pictures as part of the layout, but it was a Japanese graphics editor by the name of Non Ishida who invented the form as we know it today. It emerged in response to a competition to design a picture which had lights go on or off in a skyscraper. At the same time, it seems that a professional Japanese puzzle setter by the name of Tetsuya Nishio also invented puzzles with the same theme. Ishida published her first puzzles in 1988 in Japan under the name Window Art Puzzles, while Nishio's puzzles were also published in a rival magazine. The puzzles soon came to the attention of James Dalgetty. Dalgetty's long career in the world of puzzles included establishing mechanical puzzle distributor and manufacturer Pentangle Puzzles, who, among other things, introduced the Rubik's Cube to the UK in 1978, lighting the fuse on a global trend. By 1989, Dalgetty had left Pentangle behind, but when Non Ishida showed him the puzzles, he still had the interest and the contacts to commercialize what had been, until this point, a niche Japanese interest. He suggested that they should be named after their creator, and so the name nonograms came to be associated with the concept, half for non after Non Ishida, and half for diagram. They were published around the world, and notably in the UK's Sunday Telegraph newspaper, which eventually polled its readers to rename them as Gridlers. Meanwhile, in 1993, Non Ishida put out her first book of nonograms, and the puzzles particularly benefited from the electronic medium, and with the emerging World Wide Web in the early 90s, huge numbers of early programs were created. In Japan, nonograms were particularly successful, but they were also gaining traction in the UK, South Africa, Sweden, the US, and other countries besides. As this was going on, Nintendo's long-time president, Hiroshi Yamauchi, was interested in expanding the kinds of people who were making games, and gave a lecture in which he asked people directly, "Why don't you enter the video games industry?" His pitch was that with so many games selling more than 1 million copies, as he put it, don't you realize how much more likely it is to win 100 million yen by creating software than it is winning 100 million yen from a lottery ticket? Perhaps not everybody was persuaded, but one person at least definitely was. In the audience was a business developer at a company that sold development tools, Makoto Nakayama. Nakayama was not a stranger to Nintendo. He was on the staff for the Famicom version of Backgammon, and in 1994 received a special thanks credit for Wario's Woods. Still, he was sufficiently motivated by Yamauchi's pitch that he set up his own company, a two-man operation with him and a young graphics designer by the name of Noichika Meguru. He called this newcomer to the gaming field the Jupiter Corporation. Yamauchi reportedly offered the neophyte company no special treatment and had them pitch titles like any newcomer to the business. However, the concept of translating the popular Japanese nonogram fad to the Game Boy did receive the green light. Not only was it a perfect handheld game, but for those who wanted to see the detailed grids a bit more clearly than the dot matrix Marvel would permit, the newly released Super Game Boy allowed the game to be played at home on the Super NES console, something that they promoted on the game's box. To make up for Jupiter's lack of game development experience, they introduced Nakayama to a gentleman who at that time was best known as the Vice President of Ape, the developer behind Earthbound. But he was later to become famous for other reasons in the future, for the man in question was Tsunekazu Ishihara. As for Miyamoto, perhaps his most consequential, if seemingly inevitable, contribution was to suggest that Mario should feature. Sadly, the game's sales appear to have been fairly anemic, although with advertisements as interesting as this unique example of the form, it is small wonder really. As a result, while the Picross series continued in Japan, first with a Picross branded title based on Japanese celebrity Tamori called Tamori's Picross, and then with Mario's Super Picross on the Super Famicom, the West was crossed out from contention. Picross 2 was released in 1996 and still featured Mario on the cover and in the game, though his name had now been expunged from the title. There was also a Satellaview Picross, which, as with all Satellaview games, it seems is lost to time. Despite this flurry of titles, Picross seemed to be on the bubble and might have faded into obscurity were it not for Nintendo Power, a service operated in Japan's ubiquitous Lawson chain of convenience stores, which allowed for games to be downloaded onto a special flash memory cartridge for a cheaper than usual price. Over half the titles were Picross games, and across 1999 and 2000, Picross titles were released to tie into many major titles: Pokemon, Yoshi's Story, Kirby, Star Fox 64, The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, Super Mario 64, Wario Land 2, and Donkey Kong Country. Still, with this service being retired, Nintendo seemingly lost their interest in nonogram games. A Pokemon Picross could have team-rocketed the series to new heights, but although announced for 1999, it was quietly cancelled. After a dozen games in just 6 years, the Picross series entered a hiatus that was to last much of the decade. It was, of course, the Nintendo DS which resurrected the concept. The outsized hit that was 2005's Brain Age made Picross an obvious game to prime for revival, and it worked particularly well with the system stylus. For the first time since Mario Picross, Nintendo even ventured to release the game in North America, and it must have done well enough this time, as it was not the last DS Picross game that would be localized. However, the new game, released in 2009 to 2010, depending on your region, was different for a couple of reasons. It was named Picross 3D, a gimmick that surely would have suited them better if they'd held it over for a year or so and dropped it with the Nintendo 3DS. But it wasn't the 3D that was the real eyebrow raiser, but the fact that, for the first time, Jupiter were not involved in the production. As Jupiter explains it, Nintendo owns the Picross name, but Jupiter owns the precise game mechanics. However, as this was a 3D version of the concept, Nintendo apparently had free rein to innovate, and so this version was created by Kirby Superstar's HAL Laboratory. Still, Picross DS could have had a sequel, but Nintendo's doubts about the game's sales potential spiked the series' wheels. As Jupiter's Norihiko Meguro explained, the last title we co-developed with Nintendo was Picross DS, which was the last full retail title. We actually pitched Picross 2 to Nintendo, but they asked, "Are you sure you're going to reach 1 million sales?" We weren't able to answer this, so that was the first time we did a licensing deal instead of a direct collaboration, and that's how the 3DS version of Picross was made. At any rate, Picross 3D seemingly revived Nintendo's interest in the series for a time, with Nintendo offering 2 exclusive games in Japan as a reward in its Club Nintendo loyalty program in 2012 and 2014, followed up with another exclusive Picross offering, this time as a reward claimable through My Nintendo Platinum Points, specifically My Nintendo Picross: The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess, which brought a Hylian hue to proceedings. Meanwhile, HAL offered up another Picross 3D for the 3DS, while Pokemon Picross finally got its day in the sun in 2015 as a free-to-play Pokemon game that instantly achieved recognition for being out that year. Still, by this point, Jupiter had evolved as a company and had worked on a number of other games, including tie-ins with Disney, co-developing The World Ends With You with Square Enix, and working on Sonic Pinball Party with Sonic Team. With the market being less reliant on physical releases, Jupiter were now able to act as their own digital publishers on the 3DS, and so began the Picross E-series, with 8 titles from 2011 to 2018. From 2017's Picross S, we got a Switch series. The developers at Jupiter would regularly pitch crossovers and tie-ins, and sometimes these would transpire. Picross S Genesis and Master System Edition is good nostalgic fun, while 2024 saw Picross S, Namco Legendary Edition, and there's a Doraemon tie-in for 2025. However, Nintendo would prove more reticent. As Jupiter's Norihiko Meguro explained to Video Game Chronicle in 2003, it's almost always us who approaches the license holder going, "Hey, why don't we do this?" Initially, we usually think about something straightforward like a standard Picross game with the collaboration integrated, but with the Final Fantasy and Pokemon Picross games, they wanted to make sure each universe was expressed well within the Picross universe. That's why those games have a different structure that makes it feel really like a Final Fantasy theme and really feel like a Pokemon theme. We're not pitching to Nintendo as much as we used to, knowing that it's not easy to convince them to say yes. Our expectation is that as long as the Picross game is based on one of their IPs, they're going to be the publisher, not Jupiter, so it's very difficult to turn it around. Nevertheless, with such a long run of games, the series seems to be going from strength to strength. Meguro noted, new people are playing the game on Switch. The Pokemon Picross game became one of the important triggers of this and introduced the game to a lot of new players via a free-to-play title with in-app purchases. With the S series, when we looked at the sales numbers, Picross has traditionally been more popular in Europe than in the US, but it's the other way around now. We now make more money in the US than in Europe. Also, Picross celebrates its 30th anniversary in 2025, just as Super Mario does, and reportedly, Jupiter are interested in doing something to celebrate Picross's 30th anniversary. With the Picross games reaching new audiences on the Nintendo Switch Online service, is it possible that Mario could discover his puzzling pastime once again? Meguro commented, "Actually, we're eager to make these collaborations happen, but it's pretty much down to Nintendo's judgment, and the final say is on their side, not ours. We want to celebrate the 30th anniversary of Picross in 2025, but Nintendo's approval process has become more difficult than ever. Going through their approval process has become more difficult than ever, so the easier way to work with Nintendo is to publish something with our own IP, not the other way around, where a developer pitches Nintendo and waits for Nintendo to provide the IP to make the collaboration happen. The fact is that when you're playing the title, the actual picture doesn't really factor into the experience much, as mostly you're thinking of the strategy to find the next tiles to uncover. It's only afterwards, when you feel you can step back and see what you've actually uncovered, that the picture comes into play. Therefore, I can see why Nintendo might feel like these crossovers aren't particularly beneficial to them in many ways. That said, although a Mario crossover hasn't happened in a very long time, the ongoing interest of Jupiter and the fact that Nintendo must be scraping the bottom of the barrel for Mario-related content they can bring to Switch 1 means that a cheap puzzler has to be a decent chance still, and so I think there is a 30% chance that we will see Mario in some form in a Picross game again by the end of 2027. In the meantime, though, there are no shortage of Picross experiences to try, and I will certainly recommend anybody who wants to try out the puzzle format giving a tilt to either the Game Boy or Super NES Mario Picrosses on Nintendo Switch Online. Thank you for watching, commenting, sharing, liking and subscribing. Thanks to the channel's Patreon supporters, and I shall see you again next time for another Nintendo Forecast.